Hello students, welcome back to science lesson. Today we'll be looking at chapter 4.3, types of variation. So in this chapter, we are learning to identify discontinuous and continuous variation. And we are also learning to choose charts and graphs to display different sorts of information. Before that, let's do some recap session. Look at the beautiful babies. Alright, every organism has their own set of features or characteristics. So variation in their characteristics help us to recognize different organisms. And so far we have learned on classification. So kingdom is the biggest of the groups that scientists use to classify organisms. So the 5 kingdoms are animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungi kingdom, Protoctista kingdom, Prokaryote kingdom. And so far we have only learned on animal kingdom and plant kingdom. So what are the difference between the animal and plant kingdom? So organisms in the plant kingdom, they make their own food. They have cell walls. They have cells with a cell wall that's made of a substance called cellulose. So organisms in the plant kingdom, they are generally not mobile. So if you look at the plants, although they do move, but they move very, very slow. Whereas organisms in the animal kingdom, they feed on other organisms, they are consumers. They have cells that do not contain cell walls and they are very mobile, right? And of course, at the same time, animal and plant kingdom, they share certain similarities. They are both multicellular organisms. Their cells contain nucleus, right? And to dive in deeper, animal kingdom is further classified into vertebrates and invertebrates. So vertebrates refers to animals that have a backbone. So whereas invertebrates refers to animals that do not have a backbone. So vertebrates are also subdivided into 5 major groups, which are the reptiles, fish, amphibians, birds, and mammals. Whereas invertebrates they are also subdivided into various subgroups. So far we have learned on annelids, echinoderms, mollusks, and arthropods. And apart from the animal kingdom, we also have the plant kingdom. So in your textbook, we have learned that plant kingdoms are categorized into 4 major groups. First of all, flowering plants. Second group, conifers. Third group, ferns. And the fourth group, mosses. And today we'll be looking at types of variation. So what does the word variation means? The word variation refers to differences, right? So this diagram here, we can see there's the proboscis monkey and the orangutan. So big differences in characteristics are seen between 2 different species, right? So you can see proboscis monkey and orangutan. Although both of them are mammal, but they have really very distinct features, right? For example, let's look at the nose of the proboscis monkey. They have a big nose. And whereas an orangutan, they only have they have really small nose. So we can see there is a very big variation, and of course the fur color looks so much different. And of course, look at the proboscis monkey. They have something else like a mane here, right? Whereas the orangutan, we don't really see that. And orangutan, they have really long limbs, if you notice. Alright, but these are all considered as big differences. So we often see big differences between 2 different species. But also at the same time, sometimes we see small differences in characteristics which can only be seen within members of the same species. Right? What does that mean? Right, for example, let's look at a diagram here. Humans are considered of the same species, considered one species, which we call it Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens. So regardless whether you're a Chinese, you're an Indian, you're an American, you're a Korean, you're a Japanese, you're an African, we are all considered as we are grouped under the same species, right? We consider same species, but sometimes we have small differences. What are the small differences that you will see here? First of all, you will see the skin color, all right? You see they have different skin color. For example, an American would have a fairer skin, whereas a Chinese would have a slightly brownish skin, whereas an African, they would have a much darker skin, a darker brown color. So these are some small differences that we see. And another difference that we can see is hair color, right? You can see they have a different. An American probably they would have blonde hair. Some humans they have an orangey hair, sometimes we call it ginger. Uh, Whereas Chinese they would have a black hair. So these are called small differences within the same species. So or another word that we use to describe would be variations, right? So in this chapter, when we use the word variation, it refers to differences in characteristics within a species. So there are two types of variations here, which are called discontinuous variation and continuous variation. First of all, let's look at discontinuous variation. So discontinuous variation refers to a variation that has distinct set of options or categories into which individuals can be placed. The characteristics of any species with only a limited number of possible values. Alright. Remember the keyword limited number of possible values shows discontinuous variation. So a few examples of discontinuous variation would be blood type, your gender, your eye color, or sometimes you could say your ability to roll tongue or your ability to not able to roll tongue. So what do we see in discontinuous variation? Let's take, for example, gender. So a gender only has a distinct set of options, which two options only. Either you're a male or a female. It cannot be something that goes in between. Or another example would be your ability to roll your tongue. So either you can roll your tongue or you cannot roll your tongue. So there is nothing in between. Whether there's no option between whether in between you can roll tongue and you cannot roll a tongue, right? There's no such option. So another example is let's take for example the number of peas in a pea pot, right? Or the number of seeds in a watermelon, right? So it has to be a whole number. It cannot be a decimal numbers. It cannot be a fractions or something else. So for example, in a watermelon seed, for example, maybe you have 30 seeds in a watermelon, and the other watermelon probably it has 34 seeds, and another watermelon it has 35 seeds. So you cannot have values that are in between. So the values tend to be a whole number, all right? So and it only has a limited number of possible values. So another example would be your blood type. So there could only be 4 blood groups, right? Either you're an AB group, an A group, a B group, or an O group. So you cannot have other groups. For example, you cannot have blood groups between B and O. There's no such thing, right? So in this case, we call it distinct sets of options. So when we portray information from a discontinuous variation, it's often in a bar chart, right? And in this bar chart, you could notice the most the one distinct feature is it has gaps between the bar, right? When you portray informations in a bar chart, remember it must have gaps between the bars, right? This is an example of how discontinuous variations is being shown. Okay, the second type of variation is called continuous variation. So what are continuous variation? Continuous variation is a variation that can have any values within a range. That means they do not have distinct categories. For any species, a characteristic that changes gradually over a range of values shows continuous variation. The two examples of continuous variation would be height and weight. So sometimes we can see that continuous variation, they actually have a set of data that has a range. So to describe a range, we find the highest and lowest values. All right, let's see. So in this continuous variation, just now I did mention that it used to, you can see the values, they are actually in whole numbers, all right? They cannot be 1.5, 1.2, 1.3, no such thing, all right? It has to be in whole numbers, whereas in continuous variation, the data, it can be in fractions. So for example, height. Between 175 cm and 176 cm, there could be endless possible values. It could be for example, let's say this guy is Chris, this guy is Daniel, right? These two guys, one is Chris, one is Daniel. Their height could be in between 175 to 176 cm. Probably Chris, his height probably is 175.2, whereas Daniel could be 175.5 cm. So they actually do not have distinct categories. And another example would be weight, right? So weight, if you have weighed yourself on a digital weighing scale before, so we tend to see there are values in between whole numbers. It could be 87.2 kg, 87.3 kg, all right? So these are two examples of continuous variation. So when it comes to continuous variation, how do you actually show your data? Let's look at this chart here. So when we draw a bar chart that shows a continuous variation, you can see there are no gaps between the bars, right? Always remember, if you're trying to show a continuous variation, the bar charts, they are all together. So that's why the word continuous, that's how the word continuous comes about, right? So the data, they are continuous, right? They are continuous. So here are differences. Here are some differences between two types of variation. So again, this continuous variation, they have distinct categories into which individuals can be placed. Whereas continuous variation, the word continuous, that means it does not have distinct categories into which individuals can be placed. So another difference between these two is these continuous variations, they are controlled by a small number of genes. Whereas continuous variation, they are controlled by a large number of genes. All right, for example, in this case, would be your gender. You either be a male or a female. So if you read something else on chromosomes, so you could either be a male or a female. All right, your chromosomes will determine your gender. And this continuous variation, they are actually not affected by environment that you live in, whereas a continuous variation, you are affected by the environment that you live in. And another difference would be data is presented on a bar chart with gaps between the bar. All right, you have to remember this when you present data from a discontinuous variation. It has to be a bar chart with gaps. When it comes to continuous variation, the word continuous tells us that the data is continuous. All right, so data is presented in a histogram or sometimes in bar charts that has no gaps between the bars. All right. So examples of a discontinuous variation would be a human blood group, your ability to roll a tongue, the types of earlobes, your gender, your eye color, sorry, not ear color, it would be eye color, uh, your hair color, right? Another, right, example of continuous variation would be your height, your weight, and your skin color. Right? Why? Okay, you need to ask yourself why skin color would be considered as a continuous variation. So again, continuous variation, as I've mentioned here, is affected by the environment that you live in. So if you notice, in colder countries, people tend to have a fairer skin, right? So colder country. So when your environment is cold, uh, yeah, you do notice they do have a fairer skin. And in warmer countries, due to the exposure of longer exposure to the sun, you tend to have a slightly darker skin. All right, you tend to have a darker skin, and your skin color just changes over time. All right, right. The skin color just changes over time as you expose longer in the sunlight. So so as you can see here, when you are exposed to the sunlight, that means you are actually affected by the environment that you live in. So longer exposure in the sunlight, of course, we know your skin would turn darker. Right, so that's it for chapter 4.3. So in this chapter so far, let's do a recap. We have learned on continuous variation and discontinuous variation. So that's the end for chapter 4. Alright, that is all. Okay, that's your teacher signing out. Bye.